Hi everyone, I'm Liz and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. Welcome back to the very last video in my Fat Quarter Hourglass Remix Quilt Along series. I've had so much fun doing this quilt series over the last, I think it's been a couple of months now, and I got my quilt back from the Long Arm Quilters and I'm ready to show you how I finish it up. Keystone Sisters Quilting did the long arm quilting for me and it turned out so great, and they are offering a discount to anyone who has been making the Fat Quarter Hourglass Remix along with me. So check out the links and info in the description box below if you're interested. So we're going to start by squaring up our quilt, and we're going to trim all the excess backing and batting away from the quilt before we bind. I think it's really helpful to do this on a large table, so I brought my cutting mat out to my dining room table to give me some more space to work. I use my square ruler to square up the corners of the quilt, and then I use my long ruler to trim down the sides. And you can see in this video that I'm just constantly checking and rechecking my positioning, making sure that I'm getting the sides of the quilt as straight as possible from corner to corner. This will just help your binding go on nicely and help your quilt lay flatter and just kind of, you know, make your quilt look a little bit more professional. So I take my time really double checking everything and making sure I'm getting my quilt nice and square. Okay, so now that I have my quilt squared up, I need to create my binding. And I really wish I had thought of this at the start of the quilt, but I didn't really think about this until I was looking around my craft room and trying to decide what I was going to use as binding, that I wanted to use a scrappy binding out of all of the scraps left over from cutting out my squares. So if you made this quilt the same way I did using fat quarters, you should have these, you know, varying widths of fabric left over from all of the fat quarters that you cut out. And so I did some quick math, and so for my quilt I used 20 fat quarters. My quilt is 60 by 75. That means I need at least 270 inches of binding, and so technically 17 of these strips will get me over that goal, because these are about 18 inches in width. So in my head I just called them 17 inches to account for seam allowances and trimming, etc. And then I just divided the 270 inches by 17 inches to see how many of these strips I would actually need. And so by my math, I would need 17. And since there's only 20 of them, I'm going to go ahead and just use all of them to make my scrappy binding, and then whatever, you know, I need to cut off at the end to join my ends will get cut off. But that's the approach I'm going to take. So this next step is basically just going to be me cutting down these strips into 2.5 inch strips to use for binding. The binding method I use calls for 2.5 inch strips that are folded in half, and then you'll sew one side, you know, to the front of your quilt, flip the other side to the back, and you can either hand stitch it or machine sew it. So first things first, I'm going to cut up all of these into 2.5 inch strips. If you remember from the video where I was cutting everything out, I cut all of the fat quarters out in pairs. So most of these are pretty lined up, but I'm going to see if I can't line this one up. And then I can do 2 at a time. I'm just going to do a 2.5 inch strip. And I'm not going to worry about the top or bottom being square because I'm going to join these on a bias rather than on a straight grain. So I'll show you that in a little bit and talk to you about why it doesn't really matter if your ends are square. Obviously, if you already got rid of your scraps from your fat quarters. Or if you just don't like the look of a scrappy binding, just pick, you know, your favorite print, and you can use the same binding method just with width of fabric strips. So you'd have 42" by 2.5" strips. But if you're doing a scrappy binding, you know, you can just use your leftovers. Okay, so I got all of my strips cut out, and from my original pairings, they were pretty like paired light and dark, medium dark, light medium, etc. So I'll probably just sew them together as is until I get to ones that are maybe like this similar in color, and then I might, you know, I just want to have a lot of contrast basically between the pieces. That way you can really see that it's a scrappy binding when it's on the quilt. So let's take this over to the sewing machine. Okay, so actually before we do the binding, I just remembered one more thing. I wanted to add one of my new quilt labels that I got from Sweetwater Quilts. The sweetwaterco.com is where I got these labels from. And they're iron-on, but it's really recommended that you iron on and stitch down. And so I should have done this before I sent the quilt to be quilted, but I just got these labels. And so all I'm gonna do is put one in the corner and top stitch it. And so yes, you'll be able to see a little bit, you know, on the front, but I don't think it'll be noticeable. These are pretty small. And so I just need to pick a label and then get it cut out, and I'm gonna attach it to the back of my quilt before I start working on the binding. So let me get this. Let me pick which one I want and get it cut out. Okay, I was just figuring out which was the bottom edge. So when you're looking at the back, this is the bottom left corner. And let's see. If I use neutral thread, this would be a really good place to put my labels. Let me mark that with a safety pin or just a sewing pin. And then I have a patriotic label that seems like it would be pretty cute with this. I think I'm gonna go with this one that's just like a signature basically. And, or should I go with the with love? Actually, yeah, I'm gonna do the handcrafted with love. Okay, so let me cut that out, and might need to read some instructions on how to adhere this again. I don't know what I did with my instructions. Okay, let me figure that out. Perfect, so now I've got my little label cut out. Do I want to cut it skinnier? No, I'll just leave it like this, and I'm just gonna top stitch it. Well, I'm gonna iron it and then top stitch it 1/8 inch all around. So let me get that ironed, and then I'll meet you back over at the sewing machine. Okay, so I've got my piece fused on, and I am gonna top stitch. So let me go to a different foot here. Well, how do I want to do this? I gotta figure out how to sew this on and get all this quilt through there. So let's see. So I'm just gonna use, I'm just gonna sew 1/8 inch inside the edge, just right along, like kind of in the margin here that I cut. And then let's see. This would definitely be easier to do when you're making your backing. Don't be like me. Actually, okay. I think what I'm gonna do is just back stitch, cut my thread, and then I'm gonna reposition the quilt and sew those last two sides because it'll be much easier than trying to shove the whole quilt under my presser foot. Okay, and so now we've got our little label sewn on here. Let's see how it looks on the front. Perfect. Okay, so here's where I sewed it on, which, I mean, you can tell if you're looking for it, but like, I feel like that blends really nicely. So perfect spot. So if you forget to add your label before you ever have everything quilted, that's my tip for trying to hide it, is find a light colored square and use like a really neutral thread, or find a dark square, use a dark thread, but I think the light works best. So let me trim up these threads and then let's finish our binding. Okay, so now I've got my pile of binding strips and I am going to attach them end to end into one long binding strip. And I am going to attach my binding pieces on the 45-degree angle. I like that a lot because it spreads out the seam. It's not just one bulky seam. Every 18 inches, it kind of smooths out the seam. And I think it's a nice transition when you're using different fabrics rather than just a hard start and stop. I like the 45-degree angle approach, and I will show you how I do that. My first tip is to use seam guide tape. So whether that's like a seam guide you can attach to your machine, like Lori Holt has one. I use this washi tape, which I've shown on my channel before. It is from Cluck Cluck Sew, and this is always on my machine. Anytime it starts peeling off, like it's kind of peeling off now, I replace it. And then I also put a piece up here to show me how, like I line the red line up with my needle, and then I have a 1/4 inch marking. So anyway, this is just helpful for doing binding later, so I'll point this out when we get to it. But I saw this tip on an Instagram reel and I really liked it, so I've started putting a piece of tape up here too. Okay, so first thing is to grab 2 pieces of binding, and I'm just going to make sure I'm using different colors, you know, that butt up against each other, so I don't just have all the reds or all the blues in a row. And so since I'm going to attach them on the 45, I lay one piece this way, and then right sides together, I lay another piece on top perpendicular. And so what we're doing is sewing a 45-degree angle so that when we press and open it up, we get 2 pieces, or we get a piece of binding with that nice 45-degree angle rather than joining it with a straight seam, which you can totally do. I just prefer the way it feels to work with a 45-degree angle when I'm actually binding, because it spreads out the bulk. So that's what I do. If you are a beginner to binding like this, I would definitely recommend pinning and maybe marking your diagonal. I do this so often, and I use my tape as a guide, that I don't pin or mark. I just line up my pieces perpendicular, and then while I hold on to them, I twist them over here, drop my needle down, make sure where the 2 fabrics meet is right up against my needle, and make sure where the 2 fabrics meet at the bottom is right on this red sewing line, and then I just start sewing. Okay, so those are our first 2 attached, and I do this in a chain piecing method, so I don't cut my threads. All I do is I lay this piece over and grab my next binding strip, lay it down, turn it, keep doing it with everything else here in my pile. Okay, well, I ran out of bobbin, so let me pause here. I like to use RFL 2311 for kind of like a good neutral color. Okay, so now we've got our big chain of binding pieces, so I'm going to cut them apart and show you how I trim them before I press. So all I do is I kind of come up to the edge and then cut across with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then when we go to press, you'll see how the binding continues. All right, so I'm going to take these over to the ironing board, and all I'm going to do is press my seams open. I don't know if people press to the side for binding. I think everyone presses open, but feel free to press how you like. But I'm going to go to the ironing board and press all of these seams open, and then I'm going to press my binding just in half. So all seams open, press in half, and then we'll come back here and attach it to the quilt. Okay, so now that we have our binding made, it's time to start attaching. And I like to work from the front of the quilt, where I sew the binding down to the front, and then I wrap it around to the back to finish it. And so there are a couple of ways to finish the binding, but the first step for me is always to sew the binding down to the front of the quilt. And I like to start on the bottom of my quilt, not too close to a corner, just kind of somewhere in the middle at the bottom, and I leave myself about a 6-inch tail of binding to join later. I like to use my basic sewing machine foot that's almost a 3/8 inch. I have a 1/4 inch foot, and then I have this foot, which is slightly larger. I use this one because I'm basically trying to sew almost 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of my binding. So this foot lets me kind of achieve that nicely. So I use this rather than my 1/4 inch foot like I would normally use for everything else. So I'm just laying my binding down straight up against the edge of the quilt. And I'll take a few stitches, back stitch, and then I am ready to go down to that first corner. Okay, and so as we approach this corner, you'll see I have this little bit of tape here, and this first black line is a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my needle. I don't know if you can see that, it's kind of hard, but basically this is the edge of my quilt right here, and so I want that to be even with that 1/4 inch line before I stop. So and then I pivot 45 degrees, and I put the point, like the corner of my quilt, on my center red line, and I stitch off the corner. So you can see I sewed up to a 1/4 inch, and then I pivoted and did a 45-degree angle off the corner. And then here is how I turn a corner. So you fold your binding straight up, creating a 45-degree angle in the corner that matches like where you just sewed. And then you fold your binding so that the fold is completely lined up with the top of your quilt at the top, and then the raw edge is lined up with the side of your quilt. So then you have this little 45-degree fold on the corner. And then there are a couple of different methods, but the method I use is I start sewing right at the edge and come all the way down. Some people start at that 45-degree. I like to tack my corners down all the way, so I start off the edge of my quilt. Okay, so on this corner, we're gonna do the exact same thing. I sew right up till the 1/4 inch mark, and then I pivot and sew off the corner. Okay, so I'm meeting back up with where I started, and I'm going to give myself about 5 or 6 inches to work with. So I'm going to end this piece here, and then I'm going to join my binding. Okay, so since I've got these 2 fabrics joined right here, I'm actually going to seam rip this off. And actually, as you can see, I have 2 strips left over. So really I only needed 18 of my strips. Just in case you're making the same size quilt as me, you'll know that you actually end up only needing 18 of the strips to make the binding. So I'm gonna seam rip this off, and then I'm gonna work on getting these attached. Okay, so I'm gonna lay this piece of binding down, and I want a 2.5 inch overlap from the shortest point of this binding piece. So this is a 2.5 inch wide ruler, so I'm just gonna lay it down and mark. Just trying to pin it so that when I take it to the sewing machine, it's in the right spot. And I am just going to be sewing a 1/4 inch away from this edge, but basically just doing my 45-degree angle, so that way when it's all sewn, our binding will lay nice and flat. So, okay, so I did a little something wrong in my measuring, and so obviously this is not going to lay flat. I measured from the wrong point for the overlap, so I'm going to seam rip this, remeasure, and then sew it back together because this ended up not quite the right size. Okay, let me do that again. I think I need to measure 2.5 inches from the longest point, not the shortest point. I normally, to be honest, join my binding straight grain at the end, but because I'm doing scrappy and everything's on the 45, I want the joining to match. So I'm just having to refresh myself. But yes, it's from this point, it's 2.5 inches. I measured originally from this point, and that is why my binding came out too long. So let me remeasure. Okay, now I'm gonna repin and bring this to the sewing machine. So 1 second. Okay, much better. So just to test it out, let me trim these threads first. But yeah, if you just kind of fold it, you can see how it lays. So I'm gonna trim this extra piece of fabric here, and going to finger press this open. Okay, and then I'm going to finish sewing this down, and we'll finish the binding. Okay, so we got our binding all joined nice and smoothly, and now it's time to finish sewing it on. So the traditional method would have you fold this over to the back and hand sew it, and that's what a lot of people like to do. I do like to finish my binding by machine, and so yeah, I think that's what I'm gonna do today rather than hand bind it. So I'm folding this over, making sure that the edge goes over the edge, past the edge of my stitching. And so I'm going to use a lot of Wonder Clips to just help me make sure my binding stays in place. I did not leave myself, I think I did a little bit too large of a seam allowance down in this corner. I'm gonna have to really play with this to get it to, I might trim up the quilt actually just a little bit right here. Yeah. So I'm just trimming a tiny bit off to help my binding fold over properly onto the back. Okay, and so then when you get to a corner, basically the side that's kind of like the top, you fold all the way down into the corner. So let me get this clipped. And then you kind of see how it makes like a little 45-degree angle. Then what you do is with this side, you just fold it straight back over to create your little 45. Okay, sorry, got interrupted by a little phone call from my nephews. Okay. And so then when I have the nice 45 here, I have a nice 45 here. And then I grab a Wonder Clip and I just clip it as securely as I can right there. And I put a few more on this side to hold everything in place. And so what I'm doing is sewing from the top side, and I'm going to sew right up against the edge of my binding and catch this fold on the back side. And so I'm using just a neutral thread because there are so many colors in this quilt. I'm just going to use my neutral thread, to hopefully kind of blend into the side here. And then you will see the top stitches along the edge of the binding on the back. So you really want to go slow and just make sure you're staying right on your line so that you're catching the binding on the back. But yes, you can see our top stitch line is just catching the back side of our binding. And then on the front, we're just hiding it right up along the seam. So as I approach the corner, I'm just going really slow and making sure everything's getting sewn down. I have a sewing stiletto that I normally use. It's just like a long pointy stiletto, but I'm just going to use my seam ripper because I don't know where my stiletto is at this point, but I use that to help guide and avoid getting my fingers in the sewing machine. So I'm just going to make sure this is folded exactly how I want it. Actually, I'm going to go kind of one stitch into the binding in the corner just to kind of secure that corner. And so then okay, and so I'm going to do a little bit more and then I'm going to check my corner and make sure everything got sewed down. Okay, let's take a look at our corner. It looks good. I missed a tiny little, oh yeah. Okay, so whenever I miss a little bit of the binding, that just got pulled a little bit. So I'll go back after I finish doing the whole quilt and just sew anything down that maybe got missed. So this little piece right here. So yeah, that's fine. I'll just go back over that corner. I'm just gonna put a clip on it to remind myself that I need to go back to that corner. that corner turned out exactly how I want it. Perfect. So we got the binding attached, and as you saw, there were a couple spots where my thread did not catch the back fold of the binding. So I'm gonna go around the quilt and just fix a couple of spots, and then we'll be done with binding. Okay, so our binding is complete and we have a finished quilt. I'm so excited. I think it turned out so well. I absolutely love how the scrappy binding turned out. I'm so happy I kept my leftovers and thought about adding that. I think the binding just adds to the overall scrappy patchwork feel of this quilt, and yeah, I'm just super happy I did that. Before we close out this series, I have a very fun giveaway for you guys. Keystone Sisters Quilting has generously provided a gift certificate, $25 for one of you. So that will be the giveaway for today. Obviously, I won't have another video where to announce the winner. I will wait a week after this video is posted and I'll draw a winner, and then I will comment on your comment. So be on the lookout for that. And yeah, one of you will win a $25 gift certificate. If you'd like to be entered in the giveaway, please be a subscriber, like the video, and leave a comment. And in your comment, use the word Keystone, and that's how I know that you want to be entered for the giveaway. Thank you all so much for joining me for my first quilt along series. I have so many ideas for my next one, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.